Hello.
I'll ring for some coffee for you.
No, thank you. I'll have another drink.
Walter.
If there's to be a discussion, I'll need another drink. Otherwise, I shall neither hear nor be coherent when and if I reply to whatever it is you're about to say.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Francis Doumet, who is the co-founder and CEO of Metaspectral. It's a platform that's compressing, streaming, analyzing, and storing multispectral and hyperspectral imagery in real time. Welcome to the show today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, I think my understanding is that the journey to your current company has been a bit of an evolution. I think it started with something called Pixel Drive, and then eventually morphed to Compression AI, and now to Metaspectra. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, the company was initially put together by my co-founder and I. My co-founder was freshly minted from his PhD in machine learning and had this crazy idea of using machine learning to compress data. So if you take a look at your typical compression algorithm like JPEG, it just uses a hard-coded formula to compress each and every image. And it does a mediocre job at, or let's say good enough job at compressing images, but that's because it's tuned for a wide variety of images. And so the idea was really, can we instead fine-tune the compression algorithm so that it, on the fly, compresses individual images much better? So you would have a tailored algorithm for a landscape or for a portrait, for instance. So the first product we developed was essentially a machine learning version of JPEG, which was able to compress data 30 to 40% more than your typical JPEG algorithm with no visual loss in the image. And so we started to market that as a way to accelerate websites, since websites tend to be 30 to 60% images. And while we had a bit of traction there, we found that the landscape was very competitive. Because this was such of an issue for websites, there was already a lot of companies out there providing similar services, like Cloudflare. ImageX is another one. And so even though we had a superior product in terms of image compression, we still had a far way to go in order to arrive to feature parity with these companies. And so, and we also realized that customers we were talking to had a switching cost. It's not very cheap to switch over from, let's say, Cloudflare over to us. And so that's when we started looking at other data formats, ones which had potentially a larger value and had a much more acute value proposition. So that's what brought us to this type of complex imagery that is called multispectral and hyperspectral imaging. So if you take a typical image, it only has 3 frequencies of light that it captures: red, green, blue. Multispectral and hyperspectral instead go deep into the infrared range. And so a multispectral image can have a different frequency bands, so a different frequencies of light. Hyperspectral can go to the hundreds, so 300 to 400 different frequencies of light for a single scene. And so a single hyperspectral image can be in the gigabytes. And so when we realized this, it was kind of like an aha moment, like, oh, well, this is like a problem that's 100 times or hundreds of times more important than traditional JPEGs, and that's what brought us to Metaspectral.
Great. Well, interesting. I was just speaking with a startup that is working on. Well, they're more of a camera and a chip, as well as a data company, but essentially working on the hyperspectra range as well. So just to help the audience understand a little bit more, I think when we talk about hyperspectral, we're talking about the spectrum for each pixel in the image of a scene. Whether it's for trying to find an object or identifying a material or detecting processes, right? And I think within the hyperspectral, there are three branches of spectra imagers. And I think you talked about some of them, but push broom scanners, whisk broom scanners, or spatial scanners, and then the spectral scanner or the band sequential scanners. Can you talk a little bit more about the spectral aspects, the metaspectral aspect, in terms of the nuances of that, like whether it's acquiring images at a different wavelength and taking a snapshot of that image over time, for instance?
Yeah. So the benefits of capturing multiple different bands is that materials reflect light in a very different way depending on the frequency of the incident light. And so by capturing a wide gamut of light, you're really able to understand, or to get a finite understanding of the material that is being imaged. It's so sensitive, in fact, that you can get down to the chemical composition, even the molecular composition to some degree. For instance, fresh meat reflects light differently than raw meat, for instance. I meant fresh meat reflects light differently than spoiled meat. And so this has applications amongst a wide array of industries, from defense, where, for instance, they're looking for camouflaged vehicles, or they're trying to detect IEDs from thousands of feet in the air, all the way to Earth observation, where hyperspectral imaging is very important in understanding crop health. You can identify a disease in a plant just through hyperspectral imaging, or you can quantify the amount of moisture that a plant is absorbing. And so these are things that you're just not capable of doing with traditional imaging.
Yeah.
And I should add that this type of imaging is not new. It's been around for decades. But what's happening today is that we've seen a decrease in the form factor, first of all, of these cameras that are capturing this type of imagery. And second, the cost has been going down drastically. They're still expensive. A single camera can still be, in the tens of thousands of dollars. But compared to what they used to be, it's already an order of magnitude cheaper.
Yeah, so we'll come back to that in terms of what that means, both from a supply as well as on the demand side. You mentioned in terms of different layer stack of bands, but also really the data set, right? And I think, based on what we found, you have like Aster and Landsat ETM Plus bands. And each of these groups of bands, I guess, are treated separately. Can you talk a little bit about, how to correct raster when using image processing routines, such as NV radiometric calibration test, for instance? Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I can definitely speak to that. It's not something we necessarily deal with, Scott. That's a bit upstream to our product. But when you do take an image, let's say from a satellite imager, the data is raw. And so it accounts for a bunch of different factors, such as the effect of the atmosphere, the effect of changing weather as the image is being taken, as well as different spatial configurations. A satellite moves, and so as it moves, the frames are in different orientation as they come in. And so when and so raw data, in order for it to be processed by us humans, has to be corrected. And the first step in the correction process is radiometric correction. And that's where we essentially correct for effects in the atmosphere that might affect an image, that might be creating hot pixels, for instance. And the second step is a spatial correction. And so that's where the different frames that are taken by the imager are aligned, so that we're actually able to have a multi-layered image that can be nicely consumed by either a human or a computer algorithm, for that matter.
Great, thank you for that. So I want to go back to what you were saying in terms of the cost of cameras, as well as the ability, the capability improving, and the marginal cost dropping. And then let's put in the context of, let's say, space. And I think the hypergrowth of suborbital in particularly, but certainly even orbital satellites. What does that mean for those satellite operators, as well as those that are consuming that data? And why is it so critically important to address the compression, the streaming, the analysis, as well as the ability to store these imagery? And again, I think the key emphasis is all in real time.
Yeah, and that's a great question. So as the optics have been decreasing in cost, we've been seeing a tremendous increase in the resolution of imagery that's being taken. For instance, there are companies now that will be launching very soon constellations that can have spatial resolutions as little as 10 centimeters on the ground. And so doing a persistent surveillance with that type of constellation leads to tremendous amount of imagery. Now, downlink bandwidth has been increasing, especially with the avenue or the advent of optical links, but the cost hasn't changed much. And so we're still paying on average about $10 per minute to transmit data down to the ground. And so for a space mission that is spanning 10, 15 years, you're easily paying tens of millions of dollars just to send the data down to the ground. Now, with smart compression algorithms that can losslessly compress data down to as little as a third of the original size, you're automatically saving a third of your data transmission costs, which amounts to millions of dollars throughout the life of the mission.
I mean, this is incredibly significant. I think for those that are less familiar, I think when we think about things like Starlink, for instance, certainly the biggest portion of the cost is really just getting it up there in terms of payload cost. But really, from a life cycle and operation, you're right. It's these downlink, and as well as the storage and the longevity and the maintenance of these systems. So it's huge. And then taking a little bit slightly further, NASA has ambitions and plans already in place to undertake some lunar lander types of projects. And again, I think these landers are going to have incredible amount of sensories, MEMS, and other camera capabilities, computer vision capabilities. And of course, it's really scanning through the really wide range of electromagnetic spectrum. How do you think, and again, let's call it in the context of land survey. So as we think about terraforming a potential, a depot on the moon, how and why are these images so critical, and why is it even more critical to compress it properly and then share it down, downlink it to Earth, since we don't have a cloud infrastructure on the moon yet?
Yeah. So first of all, Scott, the farther away you get from the Earth and therefore the sun, the more power is an issue on board spacecraft. And so spacecraft need to become more and more power efficient as they travel farther away from the sun. So one way to reduce power consumption is to reduce the usage of the transmitter, since that's one of the main power consumptions on board an aircraft. So compressing the data means you transmit less, means you consume less power. But also on the data analysis side, because we also want to consume power, we also need the algorithms to be fairly efficient, the algorithms that are on board to analyze the data. And that oftentimes leads to suboptimal algorithms that are trimmed down and that aren't really able to detect things that we want to detect. And when I say that, I mean, especially for kind of persistent ISR type applications, we're really looking for needles in a haystack, which are hard to find. Like, again, maybe like an IED or a camouflage vehicle from space. And so being able to compress this data on board the imager in space and send it down to the ground allows us to be able to use much more powerful machine learning algorithms on the ground than we could ever have on board an imager to find these things that we're looking for.
Now, let me ask you, in terms of kind of a value add stack from a product portfolio, I know you guys are focused on kind of the edge compression, but isn't there also value in the ability to handle the data? We talked about the different kinds of, filters or, signal processing effect and so forth. Isn't there value in those kind of data analysis, filters, algorithms? And are you guys looking to extend your product to some of those so it's a little bit more holistic?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something we are actively doing, actually. We don't believe as a company that a compression algorithm is a sufficient moat to build a business. But on the other hand, one of our advantages is that while we compress the data on board the imager, it still has to be decompressed on the ground. And when it's being decompressed on the ground, we have all that data in memory. And that allows us to do super fast real-time processing of that data as it's being received on the ground. And so, especially when we get to the hyperspectral imaging level, that the sheer volume of that data is so large that even on the ground, the main go-to method today is to kind of truncate the data and find the main components to analyze. What we do instead is we've devised machine learning algorithms that can actually run very efficiently on this hyperspectral data, and that can really find the tiniest variations in the data that can detect anomalies on the ground. And so our grand vision is to essentially do the compression on the spacecraft, send that directly down to a ground station, and once it gets to your office, it's already been analyzed and you already have all the metadata you need to do your analysis.
I can't emphasize how important that is because, I think, cost savings, of course, I think everybody understands, certainly the CFO does, but the users and those that complain about the users when they're having to, work with this massive data, like I said, truncate or some other techniques, and you're basically streamlining it and then be able to simply maybe hopefully, click and choose a set of, algorithm filters to be able to identify what they're looking for. That's a huge time savers and it really reduces the friction and adds a tremendous amount of value. What's the kind of response been in terms of whether it's defense or aerospace to your technology?
No, it's been great. We actually kind of started shifting to, the Metaspectral product right when there was this surge in space startups. That started about a couple of years ago, mostly driven by the decrease in cost associated with going to space. And so a lot of these startups are really focused on this high resolution imagery. It can be spectral, but can also be, SAR, which I'm sure you've heard of, synthetic aperture radar, which has been, again, getting a lot of traction because of the decreased cost in running these programs. And so we've demonstrated the capability to save multi-million dollars on the lifetime of these missions. And we've had a fantastic reception both for space applications and also for military in the air. So, for instance, we did a pilot at the end of 2020 with a Canadian military, and they're often resort to flying their sensors on board manned aircraft because they don't have the bandwidth to transmit the raw data down to the ground and do the analysis down there. And so this obviously limits the range of the mission, and all that. So we really believe that we have this enabling technology that allows for new applications, mainly in the real-time domain.
I'm actually very excited. I really enjoyed learning about this, and I think the applications are there's going to be a lot more use cases to be merged. Let me ask you the last question, which is lessons learned, whether it's a product or project failure, and any insights that you can share with the audience.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, if you're launching a startup, it's 10 times easier if you start from a problem that you've experienced yourself. I think one of the mistakes, or not mistakes, but it's a mistake, but also just a disadvantage, I guess, for a startup is to start with a cool technology that is looking for a problem, and that's kind of what we started with Compression AI, which was the original name of our company, and it's much easier if you start the other way around and find a clear problem, a clear customer, and then build a product from the ground up that way.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for that. And again, I think that's quite common when it comes from research-based and oftentimes even university-based as well. Right. So with that, we've been joined by Francis Doumet, CEO of Metaspectral. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you, Scott.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.